Oliver, hello.
Kathelin, hi. Can I just say thank you for everyone for being here, because Kathlin's quite right. We ought to be outside picking flowers in the spring sunshine.
Yes.
So let's get this over with quickly, shall we?
Yes. Let's plunge in. One of the things about William Burroughs that is quite distinctive about him, he is a cultural figure. He's not just a writer. He's not just a painter. He's a cultural figure. And depending on whom you talk to, there's different ways into Burroughs. He has this kind of monolithic, stereotypical, gaunt man in a three-piece suit and a hat with a needle in his arm kind of thing. But that is a stereotype. Also, in a way, it's a brand. But you can enter Burroughs through his influence on musicians like David Bowie and many others, or filmmakers, or having seen a film about Burroughs or referencing his work, through his writings, through his straightforward novels, of which there are few, or his experimental novels, his essays, his interviews, or as a style icon, which I think is quite valid way to enter the world of Burroughs. There's something about him that is fascinating. El hombre invisible, the invisible man that fascinates you. And you wrote a book, actually, called William Burroughs and the Secret of Fascination. What makes him so fascinating, would you say?
Sorry, you want me to tell the secret?
Oh.
No. Yeah, I think you put your finger on something quite obvious, which is that there are many different Burroughses, and I suppose my idea of fascination was to simplify out, to kind of get behind the different facets into a kind of intersubjective relationship. In other words, if something is interesting, you have a relationship to it which is logical. Yeah, lots of interesting things about Burroughs. Fascination was my attempt to describe something which exceeds interest. That's to say, there are things which might repel you as well as attract you, things that might be seductive but also sinister. So it's a relationship we have with Burroughs which is not easily explicable. That's what I'm trying to get at. So although he's very interesting in lots of different ways, what I was trying to get at was something which is difficult to grasp and yet which in some sense grasps us. So I was trying to understand my own interest in Burroughs, and I spent a long time trying to understand it. And it's not, I don't think, personal to me. I think it's more cultural, as you're getting at. What is his status? Why does he appeal? Why does he still have legs long after he's died? How do we cope with work which is ugly as well as beautiful, excruciating as well as hilarious? How do we kind of reconcile that with our own interest in him? So we've got lots of thematic things we can talk about. But Secret of Fascination was an attempt to kind of to understand what seduces, because Burroughs is not my type of guy.
Despite the fact you've been obsessed with him for 40 years.
40 years of obsession, you would think he must be my type, but honestly, he's not. Again, I think that's, just being a straight guy from England, I had so little in common with him, and I'm quite glad that I first met him out in Kansas. I don't know how many of you have been to Kansas. I know a few people have here, but I'm from Manchester. Yeah, going to Kansas was like, where am I? I felt like Dorothy. And I think that was actually quite helpful because it clarified that there'd be things I would never understand about Burroughs. And it helps that I'm not a biographer like Miles is, because I don't try to understand him on that level. But it made me realize that it's very bizarre to relate so much to somebody who is so different to me. And I think that's one common denominator. A lot of people whose lives are very different to his, nevertheless can find in his work things to relate to. And I don't just mean the ideas and the themes, because my Burroughs is not a man of ideas. He had lots of ideas, I know, but for me, it's not how I think about him. It's not how I feel about him. How I feel about Burroughs is more personal and intimate and, like I say, inexplicable in a way. So fascination is what's left when you've ticked off all the boxes for why you might be interested in Burroughs, which in my case, it reminds me of, I think it was the mid-1980s. I got friendly with Michael Delanoy, who was the editor of Denton Welch's journals and so on. And I met Michael about 2 or 3 times, and each time I met him, this is like in 1988, 1989, he would say, "So you're still working on Burroughs?" So you meant to laugh at this point, because that was like 40 years ago. So what I was trying to get at in that book was, is my relationship with him totally aberrant and there's something pathological about me? Or am I trying to understand something which has engaged generations of people from quite different backgrounds for whom Burroughs is more than another writer? Because there are other writers who are interesting as writers, but don't check all those kind of odd miscellany that you ran through of lists, of his kind of identity. It's so varied. It doesn't make much sense.
So maybe it was totally an accident. Okay, there we go. Maybe it was totally an accident then when you were doing your dissertation and you were looking for someone who hadn't been written about before, and you happened to stumble on Burroughs. How did you come to it?
That's a very good point. I had my first encounters with Burroughs were all through the Manchester band scene. Got older sisters who were kind of hanging out with the bands. The bands had 3 things in common. They played music, they did drugs, and they all read William Burroughs. If you ever heard me play the guitar or the piano, you'd ask me to stop. My taste in drugs is very soft, so all that left was Burroughs to be cool. So I got into Burroughs, as we were having this discussion beforehand, for all the wrong reasons, all the superficial reasons. And I didn't know at that time that I'd be still, 40 years later, turning into an old guy, still doing this stuff. It didn't occur to me. I also had a girlfriend who was just very, very interesting taste in reading, and she gave me lots of Burroughs. And then when I mentioned it to my professor at Oxford, I fancy doing a PhD on Burroughs, he just crossed himself and said, "Well, you can kiss goodbye to a career then, can't you, darling?" And at that age, I didn't want a job. That was fine. And so I was doing it for perverse reasons, which actually, in Burroughs' world, is quite a good reason.
But you see, you mentioned something that, as you know, because we just mentioned it 5 minutes ago, you said you got interested in him for the wrong reasons. But I don't think there are wrong reasons. It's part of the way in to, you were talking about, say, his influence on music, the drugs, the style icon business. Is that what you're talking about by the wrong reasons? What do you mean by wrong reasons? Because I think
Can I take that back? Can I take that back now?
Those reasons are quite valid reasons because
I guess there's superficial reasons. That's what I'm getting at. It was exactly the image and the sound and other people being cool who were interested in him, and therefore it was a kind of chain effect. But the people who had Nova Express next to their Frank Zappa albums and their Rizla papers, they were not interested in producing footnotes to the soft machine. So how did I manage to do something which, from one level, originally I was going to study Shelley. I was going to spend my life studying Shelley because, my first love. And then I realized I might end up, in university archives with dusty pieces of manuscripts forever. So I chose Burroughs because he was alive. I didn't realize I'd then end up in the archives, but that's a different story. So he was alive. And that made a certain difference, whereas most of my friends at Oxford wanted to study sort of medieval plays and things. I mean, not my scene at all. I'm not an academic really. I'm just pretending to be one. I suppose when I say wrong reasons, that they're superficial reasons. They're reasons we have in common. They're not the reasons, for example, that you fell in with Burroughs because you actually knew him as a person. And I think one of the things that we should discuss today is Burroughs the man, as well as Burroughs the writer, Burroughs the myth, Burroughs the prophet, and so on. So can I ask you a question about Burroughs the man? Because your background in some ways is also complicated as mine in terms of why you should be friendly and have known Burroughs for the years that you did. How did you get
I'm
into
a
him?
straight cisgender woman.
Exactly, go on. What are you doing with him then?
Well, wait a minute. Before you get to ask me a question, let me just follow on a similar theme and ask you, what was it like for you? You first met him in 1984, is that it? When you came to New York and you wrote this beautiful book. By the way, books by Oliver and by Miles, you can either get here or find out how to order them. But you wrote this book recently called One Shot, where you, it is a gorgeous book.
Can I clarify? I get no royalties. It's purely a labour of love.
which is about having seen this iconic photograph of the beats of Ginsberg and Kerouac and William, and what's his name, Hal Chase, who was a friend of Cassidy's, I think. But you saw this, it's this iconic photograph of the early beats that everybody had seen. I don't think I've ever seen it, by the way. I don't know. But it's an iconic photograph, and you followed that photograph so beautifully in this book to solve a basic mystery about it. But it describes your arrival in New York in 1984, and you were on your Burroughs path. Can you describe that early, you're arriving in New York, and then you're meeting with Burroughs at the point you did meet with him, and what that was like for you to see the man after this kind of academic preparation?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for me it was just like a turning point in my life. First time in America, first time meeting people like Ginsberg in New York, and then Burroughs in Kansas, and I didn't get to meet Corso. I had a phone call with Gregory. That's worth a good story, by the way. I'll come back to it. Yeah, what was it like? Well, I was 23 and I knew far less than I know now. So everything was very fresh to me and very exciting. And people were very generous with their time, as was Burroughs, actually. And I think that's one of my takeaways when I went to Lawrence and spent a month there, that I really was nobody from nowhere. And it was very, very generous of him to sort of let me in and just talk and go shopping for cat food and things like that in the supermarket, and just go shooting at Lone Star Lake, and all those kind of things. So it was very it's very important in my life. But as I say, the thing that really struck me was the difference, the distance, and I found that quite engaging in an emotional way, actually, in a funny sense. That he was somebody who was more human. This sounds stupid. It made me feel very heartless thinking back, that I'd imagined him as being a kind of a phenomenon rather than a person. And it was quite a shock to realise that he made me want to hug him, which, again, in retrospect, you think, hug William Burroughs? I don't know, Miles, did you hug him a lot? Of course you do, because you knew him. And I didn't. I mean, I met him, quite different things. So why would I want to hug him? So there was something, I still remember very vividly, sort of passing his bedroom, and it looked like a spare room for guests. There was something very, very lonely and sad about it. And that was not the Burroughs I'd identified with. I'd identified with the Burroughs for whom, nothing is true, everything is permitted. A kind of very radical Burroughs, a very kind of dangerous, exciting Burroughs. And here was somebody who seemed much more human. And I think looking back on it, it made me realise how much I'd missed in the way I'd approached him. And that's what I meant about superficial approach to him, really. It was two-dimensional.
Yeah, because it's interesting. You read about the people who go to meet Burroughs in the bunker or wherever to interview him or just as a fan, and he sits there and doesn't answer them, and those anecdotes sprinkled all over the literature make him seem very removed. And this is a Burroughs I didn't know. So to answer your question, and I spoke about it last night at Reference Point a bit, so those of you who were there, but I was involved in creating a brand new research institute that was going to make a new civilization. And so in our first conference, this was 1974, we decided to invite people who we really wanted to meet. The one person I wanted to meet in the world was William Burroughs. And this is because as a teenager, I had read Naked Lunch, and somehow I understood what it was. I understood that it was an expose of front page news, that the sensationalism in sex and violence that runs throughout Naked Lunch is something that we become inured to every day. The wars, the toxicity, the gunshots, the murders, the horrors are what sells newspapers, right? And it was discovered that you can't really, it's hard to sell newspapers with good news. So there is this feedback loop. Sex and violence sells, so write more sex and violence, and then your brain becomes inured to it. So a Naked Lunch for me, I saw what he was doing, and I don't know how, but I saw what he was doing also with the language, because it's very dense language, and it's almost it's a very rich diet. So I invited him to speak at our first conference on language as a control system. I wrote to Grove Press. They forwarded the communication, and he accepted. He was on his way to California, so my God. So I was going to finally meet William Burroughs. He had just moved to New York, and this was months after he met James Grauerholz, who was his manager and companion for the rest of his life. So James came with William to New Mexico, to this kind of funky 70s style ranch with a geodesic dome and pigs and adobe rooms and so on. So I picked him up at the airport, but I didn't recognize him coming off the plane. And then I realized it was this man who was dressed so exquisitely, costumed, as it were, as a Southwest geologist. That had to have been him, because he's a style it's uncanny the way he can costume himself. It's really amazing. If you would go to Kansas, there he would be with a military hat and a military jacket and a plaid shirt and jeans and boots and the whole thing, or the three-piece suit. He was amazing in style, and that's part of his allure, I think. So, and on the way up, we drove for an hour. On the way up, I had a flat tire, which he helped to change, which nobody, especially James Grauerholz, nobody believed, but he helped change the flat tire. And we stopped for vodka and Coke, and then to buy it to have for the duration of the conference. And then when we arrived at this ranch, I was showing him to his room, and then I stopped. And I said, I have two questions for you. So we stood facing each other, and what do I call you? And he said, call me William. And I'm going to jump our subjects that we so carefully organized, because this is International Women's Day today. And today we are talking about William S. Burroughs, who is known in many circles as a huge misogynist. But I said, what is your attitude towards women? Because what you get from his writing is very particular. And he murmured, I killed the only woman I ever loved. And we just stood stock still. And it was one tear, and then he started crying, and then I held him, and he was sobbing. He'd never talked about it. This is before his introduction to Queer in 1985, when it was finally published, where he talks about having shot Joan Vollmer, his second wife. and he talked about the bits of her that he loved and how she'd saved him at one point and all of this. And that's the last time we spoke about it until the show in 1988, when there was another event that happened in the course of his interview in this room at the October Gallery. But I felt that was enough. And that act rendered him beyond redemption. He couldn't convert to Christianity or some, to Buddhism or to whatever and absolve himself for having killed his wife. There was nothing he could do to relieve that the fact that he killed the only woman that he ever loved. Okay, so that launched, of course, his career in writing and his efforts to exorcise himself and absolve himself from that, to find out, more importantly, to find out what happened that day when the ugly spirit entered him. What actually and exactly happened that led to that? And by extension, what is it about Homo sapiens, Homo know-it-all, that we've made this such a fucked up mess of this planet in our lives? And what is it, that ugly spirit in all of us? And what could he do to exorcise himself, but to analyze, to deconstruct, to all of that? So the Burroughs that I knew was on that level of emotionality. And I didn't find him sad at all. I didn't find his room in Kansas sad at all. I found it very Midwestern and spare and, very, he didn't like a fancy atmosphere. He loved food. He had a great appetite. He would have loved the lunch that our lovely director, Chili Hawes, made for Oliver and I today, the roast chicken and the cornbread and all of that. He would have gobbled that up.
I wish you hadn't said that, because I actually cooked for him and I made him my best Moroccan fish dish and he didn't touch it. So I thought he had no taste in food. Now you're telling me he's a bloody gourmand. There are mistakes too monstrous for remorse, was what he said, quoting Edward Arlington Robinson about killing a 28-year-old mother of two, which is what she was.
But what we have to remember also, simultaneously, in parallel, in his life, was that when he left Vienna in 1938, just before Hitler's Anschluss, he took with him Ilse Klapper, a Jewess, and married her, took her to the United States to save her from the Holocaust. So he saved one wife and killed the other. So this aspect of William, the interpersonal aspect of him, he really, throughout his life, he had another person, the other person, or the group of people that he would bounce off of. The Kerouacs, the Ginsbergs, the Gysons, the Grauerholzes, and all of that. What is your take as you've gone through the writing? How important was that? And you write about it in the book, One Shot, that cadre of people. Other people were so important to him.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, he played the role of the shaman for others, but he himself also looked up to other people. With Gysin most obviously. So there's a kind of playing both sides of it in a way there. I don't know. I mean, I suppose my interest in the 1940s scene is partly because it's sort of New York, so iconic in the mid-40s. It's all in black and white, and you have Kerouac sort of mythologizing Burroughs almost immediately. Ginsberg, again idolizing him. I mean, Ginsberg was a teenager, obviously. His first crush was Rambo, and his second was Burroughs. I mean, it's sort of. It must be strange to be worshipped, someone like Burroughs at that point, because what were his achievements? Nothing. So I think that must have been so intense, that scene. And one reason actually why I ended up writing an entire book about so one photograph in here was because a lot depends on whether it was taken at the beginning or the middle or the end of a series of relationships which were changing so dramatically and so quickly, and it was such an intense period. And from one point of view, that photograph, it's, you know, there's Burroughs on one side, then there's Ginsberg, then there's Kerouac, and there's Hal Chase. It looks like a selfie from freshmen. You know, it looks like any university group of students. And so it looks like nothing. But actually, in 1945, when that picture was taken, it's more than that. It was actually an occasion. It was an occasion when they were photographing themselves because they had a sense of who they were and who they might become. So there's a kind of future orientation in that picture, which suggests some of the kind of hopes they might have had, the ambition. And of course, we look at that in retrospect. We look back on it and then see them looking in the future. So it's quite an interesting kind of moment. But that's one scene, and then you get, he's in East Texas pretending to be a good old boy, which, Rob Johnson's written kind of the best essay about that in Naked Lunch at 50, the book of essays that Ian and I edited. Rob Johnson writes beautifully about how if you're from East Texas, as he was, or from a southerner, the good old boy is actually very close under the surface, under the skin. And I think that's actually, it comes back to what you were saying about Burroughs' misogyny. Was he a misogynist? Yes. Is that remarkable? No. I'm inclined to sort of think about what Bret Easton Ellis said when he was accused of misogyny with American Psycho, which is a book I cannot read. I find it repulsive, much harder than Burroughs to read. And he said, most men are misogynistic. It's not news. So from that point of view, I think what Burroughs was doing was, as you were saying, confronting that which in him is ugly. And I think you deserve credit for confronting things rather than, as he would feel, kind of bad faith liberalism where you want to airbrush it out and pretend it's not there. He was much more disturbed that it was there and wanted it in the open, better out than in. So I think from that point of view, he was bringing out of himself the DNA that he'd inherited as a man from haute bourgeois background in Midwest. Interesting what you say about the Midwest and his sparse bedroom, because that's again the kind of thing which, being from Manchester, I don't get that, you see. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the whole thing, the red clapboard house with a little fence and
very modest, isn't it?
Very, very modest, next to a little creek in Lawrence, Kansas, which is a university town. But he specifically, there's a color, red oxide. In the United States we call it barn red. And barns are painted red oxide, and it's a typical color to paint. I don't know why. Anyway, he chose somehow this shade of red oxide that you looked at this modest little house from the street with, as I say, the roses climbing along the trellis, and a typical Midwestern house, and somehow the color was like it glowed. It looked like a UFO somehow. There was something weird about that modest little house. I don't know if you noticed it, or if you've noticed it, but it was some weird, and then you go in and...
I actually had the opposite experience. I thought it looked like an FBI safe house. It looked so anonymous. It could be anyone could live there. Why was William Burroughs, hiding out? Witness protection, I don't know. It looked grey and anonymous to me, but you saw it as being an artwork.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was anonymous, but there was something that was the reverse in such an extraordinary way. And so he lived there for the last 11 years of his life, something like that. And he also had a house that Stephen Lowe, his friend, got for him that he was able to paint in. So he was able to, because his house was quite small. There was a small living room, and then his collection of canes and everything. He loved canes, and a guest bedroom where he also had his art and his own bedroom, little kitchen. That's it, except for the basement where he had his. You want to describe that, Miles? He had where he had his guns and his target practice, and then of course because Europeans don't understand Americans' relationship to guns. It seems, I mean, my father had a gun. Every head of the household in our neighborhood had a gun. It was a hunting rifle or for protection. Every American is, aware of having to protect themselves from the founding of the country, and it's like the mutual deterrent. It's like if every nation has an atom bomb, then nobody's going to drop the bomb, right? Everybody has a gun, then nobody's going to use a gun, right? That was the idea. And so you get this flaw in American, in human nature that enables this extreme violence in the United States, but that does not stop an American from saying, I have my right to protect myself. So, I don't know, I'm slightly wandering in this, but...
No, not at all, but I mean, I think you can tell that Burroughs had my number, because when we went out to Lone Star Lake and he had these guns, I'd never seen a gun before in my life, and I said to him rather naively, is it loaded? And he looked at me, he fixed me with his look, and he did the famous drawl, and he said, oh, my guns are loaded. And he obviously knew that as a prissy Englishman, I'd never seen a gun, let alone held one. And then he went off to look for something to shoot, it's like, to me, it was like, what? So I didn't get it at all. I know, Miles, you've had a conversation about this with me before because you actually were brought up with guns in England, weren't you? Yeah, where they shoot tourists.
He comes from the Cotswolds.
But for me, not at all. So yeah, that's a definite cultural barrier which I don't get. And yeah, I mean, I think his position on gun control is libertarian, isn't it? Which is that his view is he doesn't think that the only people to have guns should be the cops and the criminals. And put like that is quite persuasive. On the other hand, there's a reason why so many Americans kill each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
because they have guns.
Because they have guns. Yeah.
Yeah, but and William had. I mean, he had when he lived his first house in Kansas. His bedroom was on this. What do you say here? First floor, and so he got himself a rope that he knotted just in case there was a fire or something in the middle of the night, that he could let himself out the window and go off to safety. He had blowguns, he had darts, he had every kind of weapon you could possibly imagine. And well, no, that's not true either. But he was well armed, and it was also an interest of his. So let's.
Can I pick up one odd psychological thing here, because it's something that, in a completely different frame of reference, I also identify with. You would think, having killed the only woman he ever loved with a gun, that he would have avoided guns. So there's something very strange in that psychology of persisting. I get the point that he was brought up with them, their second nature, but it's psychology 101, that if you're not avoiding it and you're over-investing in it, then it's a kind of way of reminding yourself of it all the time without necessarily confronting it. So I don't want to, shooting things, yeah. On the other hand, I will keep saying this, I'm not the biographer in the room here, so I'm not actually going to try and psychoanalyze Burroughs, because in the end, I like to kind of keep my place, which is I'm happy talking about the work. Well, you have a question about the work, Kathelin?
Yeah, we're about to.
That's my forte.
We're about to move on to that, but I'll just mention that he was psychoanalyzed for 3 years, and all throughout his life he got therapies of different sorts. I mean, this wasn't just writing that he thought he would self-analyze. And finally, the ugly spirit, which is what Brion Gysin identified, was that aspect inside of him that caused him to shoot Joan, was exorcised in, I believe he said, in a sweat lodge, a shaman in a sweat lodge, which was just a few years before he died. So he kept on studying himself, and part the secret of his fascination. You mentioned it earlier. He is non-avoidant. He goes right to it, and that courage to just be who he is, who he was part of his fascination. And it's a lesson for all of us who may try to accommodate or prevaricate or something. No.
I think what's really interesting there also is that he didn't use this as an alibi, but I think he understood by the ugly spirit as a phrase. I think he understood the worst of himself. And he identified that very strongly also, used the same phrase, ugly spirit, to identify that class of American business that he was born into and loathed with a vengeance. So I think he identified the kind of cultural imprinting on him, which is, of course, difficult for us to do because, we don't see. It's very hard for us to get outside ourselves enough to see ourselves from within the culture that we're in and we're from, and that's one of his desires, wasn't it? Really.
Well, his paternal uncle Ivy Lee, Poison Ivy Lee, had one of the first PR firms, and then on the other side of his family was an adding machine, the Burroughs adding machine. So he took both of those inheritances and the crimes that would build up for calculating money. Was it Stephen Fry said that AI is the most important invention in human history since money, and that everything has to do with money. You think, is it the Gutenberg press? Is it, what is it? No, money, AI, everything. He understood that everything's about money, and then that is ensured by thought control, by public relations. So let's.
I think also just to pick up on that again, I think his great subject in the round is complicity. And I think that's where he's so hard on himself, because I think he recognises his own complicity. And again, I think one reason why Burroughs is uncomfortable, if you're properly engaging with him, he's very funny, let's face it. We're not talking about his humour, but he's terribly funny. But even his laughter is sick jokes. So I think that element of
gallows humour.
It's gallows humour, but I think it's also humour that indicts, and therefore, because he relishes things that we would like to airbrush out. I think that getting it out as a form of a joke is a kind of form of release, but it's also, again, it's uncomfortable. It's not liberating in that way. So I think that these confrontations, that they're all designed to expose bad faith. That's what I would say.
So one of his primary contributions with Brion Gysin was what we've come to, and they called cut-ups. And there is in order to deconstruct control, if it's inner control by limiting your thoughts or external control by influence and complicity with that. So there is this legend or this story that Brion Gysin was using an X-Acto knife and sliced through some newspapers and then called Bill in another hotel room in the Beat Hotel, said, "Oh, look at this, we can switch things around." But according to you, that's not the way cut-ups originated in the way that Gysin and Burroughs used cut-ups. How did that, in your discovery, in your archaeology?
I think the way I'd put it is that it's unsurprising that this is a kind of mythology, because I think they both recognize quite quickly that when you're trying to launch a movement out of a method, which is what they quite quickly were trying to do, you need an origin story. And good origin stories have their basis in truth. It's very selective. And as you know, by kind of cherry picking the facts you present, you actually tell a different story. So the thing that struck me most was in the Berg collection of the Newark Public Library, discovering the original manuscript that Gysin had worked on when he first encountered the method as you describe it. And what struck me was, this is a manuscript to like 20 or 30 pages. And if you add up all the different parts of the manuscript and see where they came from different newspapers, he had cut up dozens of articles from several different newspapers. It was a time-consuming process. And on about, I think it's about page 15 or something, he actually has a little note saying, at this point, I showed William the manuscript. In other words, he'd worked on a manuscript. This was not the images here, he cuts through, he holds up a piece of paper, he's laughing his head off, and Burroughs walks in and says, "What have you got, Brion?" No, that's not true. Equally, what's interesting is that, as we know, Burroughs was being interviewed by a photographer and reporter double act from Life magazine. And that did happen on October the 1st, 1959. These facts are well known. Miles has established them long ago. But I think what's interesting is that the bulk of the material they first used was not from Time or Life. It was from the Herald Tribune, which was the paper that they all read. But the Herald Tribune didn't make such a good story. Why? Because the reporters were from Time and Life, not from the Herald Tribune. So you can see how by just cherry-picking which facts you mention, you tell a better story. And they wanted a good story. So that for me helps understand why they mythologized, why they promoted some information and not others. But in the end, if you want to launch a cut-up project movement and so on, you need a good story.
So how would you say that their cut-ups, the Gysin Burroughs cut-ups, differed from the Dadaist, Tristan Tzara, just picking things out of a hat? What is particular about the way that they used the mosaic or the cut-up? Because you've done how many books that were created through cut-ups, and excavated so much material about it. What's different about the way they used it that was so influential?
Yeah, well there's two things here. One is the actual techniques, and the other is how long they persisted with the techniques. And having spent, I don't know, how many years it is, reverse engineering, that experience of being so immersed in cut-ups, just from the point of view of understanding what they did, it messed with my head. What it was like to actually do it, the scale of it, I think, was the intensity of it is quite different. Tzara essentially was doing a stunt. Essentially, he was mocking it. So when his famous poem Out of a Hat, or actually Out of a Sack, he was saying, the poem will resemble you, and it will show you to be a great poet. He was mocking the idea that poetry can be reduced to a method. So what Burroughs and Gysin were doing was actually taking it totally straight. Oh, poetry can be reduced to a method. Well, let's do it then. So in a way, they were kind of removing the irony out of it. And I think one of the things that I felt was that most people who'd written about cut-ups superficially saw it as being a stunt, a gimmick. They saw it as being a gesture. They saw it as being anarchic, Dadaist, nihilistic. It was those things to some degree, but what distinguishes them is obviously Burroughs spent a decade on it and was very creative. And again, the thing that struck me looking at all the manuscripts was, wow, the amount of work that went into it.
I think that's
really huge amount of work.
That's really key for both Gysin and Burroughs. You don't realize how hard, like with that 20-page manuscript that you described, Gysin produced before he introduced the idea of a new cut-ups to William.
And, I think what's interesting here is that it doesn't quite fit the image they wanted to project. That they actually were that serious and they worked that hard. They would rather it was a bit more spontaneous and a bit. I think that. So again, they were the version of the story they were telling served a purpose. It's just not entirely true. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, and it masks how, as you mentioned, how hard it was that they worked. I mean, I've been with Burroughs, day on, day after day, and he had, in my experience, a tremendous work ethic. I mean, he just sat down at that typewriter and typed, and you don't think of the tremendous work ethic of William Burroughs. You think of, as you mentioned, something more haphazard or spontaneous, or these spontaneous riffs. I mean, his interviews. You look at his interviews, or something like Gus Van Zant's the Thanksgiving Prayer or something, and my God, the precision, the intellectual precision is just mind-boggling. You could not interview him and win any argument because you would just be wrong if you were approaching something in an incorrect way. William would, his riposte were right there. His intellect was so incisive, but also he rehearsed his routines. He rehearsed, he was going to do a reading, he rehearsed, and that voice of his, which is unmistakable, 2 seconds of that sound, and it's William S. Burroughs. He rehearsed his voice. It's a technique, and so much of him. That's why I think you can enter him in all of these different ways. He was himself a multifaceted artist, and he worked on it. He worked on his voice. He worked on his costume. He worked on his writing. He worked on his painting. And he attacked painting and drawing with the same force and work ethic that he had with writing. And that is, art should look easy, right? Art should look easy, right? And
I think one problem is the original context in which Burroughs emerged obviously was the Beats, and Kerouac has a lot to answer for. For his notion of spontaneity, which Kerouac worked at it as well, so there was a kind of mythologization of spontaneity there, and also for the kind of myth making that presented Burroughs as being a Kansas minister with mysteries and fires on the road and so on. He made him. When I think of the iconic Burroughs image, I hear that wonderful clang of the tubular bell at the beginning of Red Right Hand by Nick Cave. Dong. He's a god. He's a ghost. He's a guru. It's got that kind of sinister, catchy image. And that doesn't go very well with the idea of somebody labouring so precisely with such kind of, as you say, a work ethic. So there's a kind of problem of reconciling the kind of public image we have of Burroughs, which he obviously contributed to, but others also mythologize. How can you reconcile that with the more craftsmanship side of him? Because I think, again, editing the cut-up text made me realise just how much attention to detail there was in there. And I was thinking, this is not what I thought I would find. It also made it much harder to edit, for one thing, but the amount of detail going in the word choices, so that he embraced spontaneity and he embraced chance, but it wasn't in order to give up control. It was a way of kind of escaping the limitations of control. But he was a fine artist, and again, that's something that we kind of lose sight of a bit.
So tell me something about your search for the real manuscripts and the real letters and the real ideas. You found collections all over the world. Describe some that have comparatively recently landed in the New York Public Library, but you must have been so many places looking for traces.
Finding the collections is not that hard because they are advertised. And I do remember when I first got to New York in October 1984, that Miles had just discovered the Interzone manuscript about 6 months earlier, hadn't you? So Miles was definitely there before me on that one. I think what I realised was that nobody was really doing manuscript work, though. And being a scholar, not a biographer, my interest was very much in terms of, well, what's underneath the bonnet? What else is in the archives? But I had no understanding that what I might find would change the oeuvre. I thought it would help explain things. I didn't know it would change them. And so I've
How did they change? Describe that. For example.
It's quite technical in a way, but I suppose part of it is to do with, as I say, sort of the amount of work that's gone into certain texts. It's not obvious. And I suppose it was also a way of understanding some of the contradictions in a text that you wouldn't notice. You would just dismiss things. And then when you look in the backstory, you begin to realise, wow, this is this way because of that. And especially with the early works that I first focused on, Junkie, Queer, and what became published as the Age Letters, I realised how contingent it was, how many kind of accidents and kind of odd contributions created the work. And again, that really changes how you understand it, especially in the case of the Yage letters. Sorry for pronouncing it Yage. I know the drug is Yahe, but Burroughs typed it Yage. The people that it didn't have the accent. It's a kind of fetish of mine that I want to kind of insist that he wasn't.
He called it Yahe.
He called it Yahe. Of course he did. He knew how to pronounce it. I didn't. So when I first read the book, it was the Yage letters. I was up with it. The point, though, was that everyone had seen these as being letters written by William Burroughs to Allen Ginsberg. And only by realizing that they were not, that he did write letters to Ginsberg, they are similar, but they're not the ones that were published. What he published was first written as notes that were turned into a journal. The journal then was given the appearance of letters, actually transforms completely our understanding of this text. Rather than it being simply, it's letters he wrote, which means almost nothing, it's somebody who's fabricating the appearance of letters. Why would you do that? That's such a strange kind of artifice that passes itself as not being artificial. Why on earth would you do it? So it gets you thinking, and once you begin thinking, you're actually doing what I think Burroughs wants us to do most, apart from react. I mean, his work is very affective. It wants a reaction, an emotional response. But I think it also wants us to think, to be provocative, not to... I think this is one of the uncomfortable sides of Burroughs. It's very difficult to sort of have a kind of innocent pleasure reading a Burroughs text. And I think that's what he doesn't want, that smooth, easily consumed kind of text. So asking those kind of tough questions about how the texts were written also helped me understand some of the difficulties in reading the text. Whereas when you're a critic, it's really easy just to have a clever interpretation, which kind of explains the text away because you've now done your clever little bit of academia, which has never seemed to be enough in the case of Burroughs, because he doesn't really satisfy you in that way.
So there's a couple more things. You studied Hassan Sabbah. He plays an important part in some of Burroughs' writings. And when I met Burroughs, and then at a certain point he said, I would go to Paris. He said, you have to meet my friend Brion Gysin. And suddenly I'm thinking, I was 23 or something like that, in 24. I'm thinking, Brion Gysin, Hassan Sabbah, streaming through the sky. I thought both of them were completely fictitious and mythologized in William's writings, but I having known them, I quickly came to the realization that Hassan Sabbah just wasn't a random person. He was very important historically. He was particularly important to Brion, because Brion followed Sufism and the history of Muslim and the Ismaili sect and all of that. But what is your take on the character of Hassan Sabbah, and what did he represent, do you think? For
I'm not going to try and summarize the a quite fat book actually called Two Assassins. It's interesting, by the way, Kathelin. I don't know if you know the title of the picture behind us.
Is The Oldest Assassin.
You couldn't make it up. I mean, this book I co-wrote with Farid Gadami, a good friend, Iranian writer, who actually is a descendant of the people of Alamut, a descendant of the assassins. And he wrote to me out of the blue. I think he contacted you, Miles, at about the same time as he contacted me. And he was, wanting to get in touch with me and so on. And to my embarrassment, I realized that I'd kind of taken the name of Hassan Sabbah in vain all these years. I knew about Hassan Sabbah. Everyone knows about Hassan Sabbah. Then I realized I didn't know anything about Hassan Sabbah at all. And I hadn't really thought through the way in which the name worked for Burroughs. And so my interest is not really in the historical figure. Farid does a fantastic job of summarizing the historical side of it. I was more interested in why would Burroughs, a WASP American 20th century writer, why would he identify himself with an 11th century Ismaili master of assassins? Why? And this isn't a passing reference. This was an obsession of his. So why? What was behind it? So, I mean, I discussed it with him when I first met him, but I didn't know enough to ask intelligent questions. And Burroughs was very good, I think, at fobbing people off as well and giving the impression there was nothing to see here. I now wear the T-shirt. What's it about? You have to read the book, but it has a lot to do with, for me, with his relationship with Gysin. And I think Gysin himself had a very strong relationship with Hassan Sabbah. But to put it at most succinct, Hassan Sabbah is a kind of open secret. If you've read the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, for example, as anyone of Burroughs' generation would have done, you would have come across the name Hassan Sabbah because the story was that Omar Khayyam went to school with Hassan Sabbah, along with an important figure in Iranian history. So it was well known, and yet it was like an open secret that the assassins from Hassan Sabbah going through the Knights Templar, going through the Illuminati in 18th century France. There's this kind of secret history. And I think one of the things that Burroughs was very excited about was the idea of a secret history. And as it's well known, he wanted to join the forerunner of the CIA. He was excited by that. The fantasist in Burroughs it really appealed to him that he had secret knowledge. And you asked me at the beginning, what is the secret of fascination? The short answer is the secret of fascination is the fascination of the secret. It's that which grasps us, seduces us, but which eludes our own grasp. And I think Burroughs is very good at that. He's very clever at giving the impression that there's more there. And by giving the impression there's more there, you stay longer. And by staying longer, you see more.
It's interesting. One of your big points that I've gotten from this afternoon is how methodical he was in creating a context for his own work in many ways. And I remember him saying to me, because one time I was in Kansas, and something happened in the news. I'll remember one day what it was. And he said, I'm going to send a telegram. And so instantly he was writing a telegram to the New York Times or something about this issue. And he said, he called me honey. Honey, you have to you have to be very proactive. You have to create a context. That's what Brion Gysin is for me. It's a context for William Burroughs. And so he was creating so much of a context for people to be able to receive his very difficult work. There's also another point that you just alluded to, which is the insider-outsider. He wanted to be a part of the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. He was thinking of becoming an academic before he actually went to Harvard and saw, no, I don't want to do this. But he had this thing where he was queer. He was trying to find his place. He wanted to achieve a powerful position, and he had this polarity of the insider being of the Burroughs and the outsider. How would you say that played out, or do you have any commentary on that?
I think it explains the strange relationship to power in his work, as well as kind of his analysis of power. That's to say, he's simultaneously at the top of the food chain, Harvard educated, haute bourgeois background, scions of American industry on one side, and a very privileged white male. On the other side, he's at the bottom of the food chain. He's a queer junkie, two despised and demonized identities in especially 1940s, 1950s America. So he's simultaneously at the top and the bottom, and you see this absolutely clearly. Not in Junkie, which is a very different kind of text. When you get to Queer, you see it completely played out in this vicious, vile, toxic, xenophobic racism and homophobia actually in the text as well. And you can see the dynamic here. You can see how this kind of, we would now say he's channeling his inner Trump. It's the worst, vilest kind of white nationalism, as it were, comes out of him. And it comes out of him precisely because he's in such a weak position. So you see a very
so he
interesting...
knows it well.
Oh yeah,
so
he knows it very well, and he despises it. But he's also kind of indulging the fantasy of it because he's so weak. So you get this very odd position of Burroughs being an insider and an outsider. And I think that's, it seems odd to call him an outsider when, we associate, white male privilege with somebody of his background. But that for him was not something he liked. He
renounced it.
He loathed it, exactly. He did his best to burn all his bridges. But it's easier said than done. You can take the boy out of America, but it's much harder to take America out of the boy. And that's what the ugly spirit was. I mean, he defined it as the ugly American. He was the ugly American.
Yeah.
Who wants to look in the mirror and see the ugly American in the morning?
And that's just when I went to Tangier with Bob Palmer. That's just what the Moroccans that met him and Sufis said is when William came to Tangier, he was the ugly American, but the edges were sanded off in his time in Morocco. He was given a sophistication. They said that, and they described some stories on how they did that, how they refined his manners for them. But you mentioned queer, and you were an advisor to Guadagnino and Daniel Craig on this last film, and you're also very firm about separating the character in the book and obviously the character in the movie from William Lee with William Burroughs. Can you talk about that experience of advising and how it related to your study of queer?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things here. One is William Lee is not William Burroughs. And I think what I'm also suggesting is that William Burroughs wasn't William Burroughs either. I mean, he's a performance artist in many ways. So, and I think the playing up of that kind of WASP identity is what you would do. It makes sense. So there's that distinction is quite important, because I think if you read especially his early work like Queer, because it's unique in the Burroughs Reserve, it's not just a kind of semi-autobiographical text. It's about a human relationship. And one of the weirdest things when I ever try and describe Burroughs to somebody who doesn't know Burroughs is to explain this is the only book he ever wrote that has a human relationship in it. And they think, well, how could you write a book without a human relationship in it? Well, read the rest of his oeuvre. There aren't. So it's the only one where he tries to describe a relationship. And obviously it's with his boyfriend at the time, this bi-curious young man, Marker. In terms of the film, my initial contact, I was approached in November 2022 by Ben Panzeca, who is the researcher for Luca Guadagnino, and my first reaction is I'm obviously very flattered and very, it's very nice to be called on to contribute to it. And then I began thinking about it, because the only Guadagnino film I'd seen at that point was Call Me by Your Name, which is a gay romance film, which is very beautiful, and I don't think we read Burroughs for beautiful romances. And so I was thinking, well, and then I thought back to the day that Ian and I went to see Cronenberg's Naked Lunch. I remember us quite high as kites skipping into the cinema, and we both came out looking at our feet. We hadn't laughed once, did we, Ian? It was miserable. But the irony is that we both knew that Cronenberg was a much more Burroughsian director than Guadagnino, for example, totally Burroughsian director. But he didn't get Burroughs' humour. There was nothing funny about The Naked Lunch. It's a clever film in lots of ways. But so partly I was quite worried. I was thinking, well, if Cronenberg didn't get it and he's quite Burroughsian, just because Guadagnino is gay, does that mean he's going to get it? Because it's too beautiful. And likewise with the casting of Daniel Craig. To my shame, most of the Craig I knew was James Bond, and I'm interested in James Bond. There's no acting in that. Then I realised, think back, and he'd been in, John Mabry's Love Is the Devil, and he'd been Sylvia Plath. He'd been Ted Hughes. He had acted before, but never in my head it was, why would you cast James Bond? So I had lots of mixed feelings about it, and then the more I worked with them, and it was a lot of fun because they were really nice. The more I realised they were getting all the good big calls right, that they were meticulous in their historical research, but they were not going to do a biopic. They were not going to lead you into this false impression that this is William Burroughs circa 1952. So I think they got that right. And, when I saw the film for the first time, I fell in love with it. I was just really bowled over. And I'm hard to please on that. I spent like 30 years. I think the first article I published on queer was in 1999. Secret Fascination queries the central text in my argument about his writing. 2010, I edited a new edition based on new manuscripts. So I had a lot of skin in that game. There's a lot of reasons why I think that's not right, you can't do that. And in the end, I just really enjoyed it. And I've watched it quite a few times since on little streaming things. So I like it a lot, but it's still a surprise that Guadagnino should have got so many things right, given that I think in many ways he's not the obvious director, but he really, I think, got it right. And Craig's performance, if you haven't seen it, I think it's just fantastic. Some wonderful scenes in it. And the way I put it was he helped me understand the text better, which, tip of my chapeau to Daniel Craig for that.
Interesting. So let's bring it up to the situation in the world right now, to ecological devastation, to the what's going on politically. Need we say more? All of this. I mean, James Grauerholz used to say that William foresaw everything. He's a fucking Nostradamus. He prophesied all kinds of things that play out. To me, when someone's called a visionary, I always think that person is living in the present moment, and most people are living in the past. It's not like they see the future. It's that they see what's going on clearly, where most of us don't even really, we get distracted by our lives or whatever. We don't see what's going on. To me, William was in the present moment, but what's going on in the planet is definitely Burroughsian in a very scary, bad way. So what would you say about his ecological interests?
I should be asking you that because because you're the one.
Okay.
After all, I mean, you introduced him to biosphere and ecotech. So no, can I ask you that question? Because I mean, and also I think his interest goes back a long way, as does yours. So it's not topical. I mean, in that sense, he was on the money. So tell us about it. How did he view the environmental issues of the day? Because obviously sometimes his agenda may not be one that we would necessarily have the same one now. He may not be, for example, I don't know, against big oil in the same way that we might want to be now, for example. So what were his interests back then?
Miles teases me because pretty much that every time I talk about Burroughs, I make him sound like this goody-goody person, and it's just like, oh, don't you really realize? But the way I see his life, he was born in 1914 in February, before World War I. He heard about it, World War I and the horrors growing up, the flu pandemic in 1918, and then the Great Depression hit. He was a teenager. The Dust Bowl, which is created by industrial agriculture, the plowing that disturbs the root structure on an industrial scale. For those of you who don't know, in the middle of the whole Midwest, just went up in dust and covered the East Coast with dust. And then on the tail of that, he goes to Harvard to study anthropology, to try to figure out, like, Western so-called civilization. Or as Gandhi said, it would be a good idea, Western civilization. Let's look at other cultures. Mayan codices, which was very important for him because it was the conjunction of word and image. And he and Joan Vollmer used to speak about the control that the Mayan priests had in word image. So it led him into that. Then when he reaches Vienna, there's the Anschluss, and he goes back to the United States. There's World War II and all of that, and the hippos were boiled in their tanks, the animal casualties of human wars, and then the nuclear bomb in 1945. So, which is when he became a junkie in 1945. Some say because of the seductive, hypnotic voice of Herbert Huncke, the hustler, but I think this other thing was going on with what he saw had happened ecologically because of the Dust Bowl and with the wars and the Holocaust. And so when I met him, as I mentioned, I invited him to this conference, Institute of Ecotechnics, And the month after William spoke, we built a ship. We built a ship in 1974-75 that wound up going up the Amazon and going under the direction of his old Harvard buddy, Richard Evans Schultes, the ethnobotanist who pretty much founded the science of ethnobotany. And William was always calling, "Oh, honey, how's the ship? Where have you been? You know, did they get to Peru yet? Has anybody taken the Banisteria copy?" You know, he would always follow that. And what's his name? Andrew Leese wrote this beautiful book, Mentored by a Madman, and then a book on Brazil where he talks. The madman being William Burroughs, when Leese is one of the foremost neurologists living. And Leese points out how William's point of view is very scientific. And you don't think of him as scientific. You don't think of him as ecological. You don't think of him having discovered botanical samples in Brazil, you know, that like an amateur botanist. You don't think of that. But in the course of knowing him, he always followed our efforts. I've seen him hold his own with microbiologists and volcanologists and explorers, Thor Heyerdahl, and all of this. He was really up on the latest in the sciences, and then inspired by his space age mythology, we built Biosphere 2, which is the largest earth science project ever built in Arizona. And it was not a prototype for a Mars colony, but with the idea of going into space or space exploration. He came to that. He followed every beat of that. He was absolutely, this is the side that people don't see of William, his ecological interest. And more and more, I would say he felt that ephemeralization and the refinement of technologies would get to the point of telepathic telepathic communications, almost like Tesla, just very ethereal, refined technologies and teleportation. And he felt that was the future, and that the human race was in a neoteny in evolution, and that we would soon change our forms. And this, what people don't realize is this is based in science. This is based in his interest in being up on the latest ideas. And so, I don't know, I see him as one of the great ecological thinkers of our times. I do. And how to deconstruct the control in your mind to be able to see the reality. And the reality is we're in very deep shit. And voila, that's it. That's all there is to it.
That's really beautifully put. I mean, as you were speaking, I got Nick Cave stuck in my head, but I kept hearing the line, "You're just a microscopic cog in his catastrophic plan." I think what's interesting about what we've discussed today is, on the one hand, Burroughs needs to be given credit for attention to detail, for craftsmanship, for being molecular in his interest in writing. Literally down to, a typo with one letter actually takes on great significance, or I've tried to establish the case. And on the other side, he's fascinated by the big picture, the very biggest picture about the Anthropocene, and as you say, so what is missing in Burroughs is what most of us actually live our lives doing, somewhere in the middle. And that's why I think the lack of human relationships in his work is quite remarkable, because it's just not there. And yet, by being both microscopic and macroscopic, he forces us to pay attention to tiny minutiae of detail and the bigger picture which escapes us because we can't see the wood for the trees. Or as Burroughs would put it in terms of politics, we're like the bull who's been trained to chase after the red cape and kind of constantly missing what's really going on behind, which is why I think his own view on politics was, obviously he'd vote for, McGovern rather than Nixon, but nevertheless, and he'd go to the '68 conference in Chicago, but his hopes were not in political parties because he could see that was not where the answer lay. So I think, in terms of scale, Burroughs is so interesting, minutiae and totally big picture.
Okay. I got to say, maybe you're talking about romantic relationships, but he was the best friend anybody could have. He had very close friendships. He maintained them. He was proactive about them. Those people that he valued could depend on him. So I don't totally
No,
agree
I'm talking
with
about
you.
what's in his work, not in his life.
Oh, okay. All right.
I mean, in his life, I must say, my experience, somebody met him 3 times, 5 or 6, was how generous he was with his time. That struck me as being bizarre because I didn't expect it.
So
it confirms. Should we throw it open to the crowd now?
Shall we open this up?
Yes,
now
please.
for questions.
You've recently been editing a book of essays re-evaluating and reappraising Burroughs' work, and you're currently writing an introduction for it for Cambridge University Press. I'm one of the contributors, and I know, speaking with other contributors, that we found it probably the hardest piece of writing in each case we've ever had to do, to give you some idea. I mean, how long is each essay in the book? Can you remind me?
Sorry, how long is what?
Each essay in the book is
we're writing 4,000-word essays.
Yeah, well, I wrote 45,000 to get it down to that, and I
Ian, you always wrote 45,000, but even if you tried it, it is hard to do 4,000.
Well,
I totally get it.
What I'm interested in is, having read all the essays, you're in a position before the publication of the book. What have you drawn from these different writers reevaluating Burroughs? All writers and artists' work go through reappraisals. Why is it so important in Burroughs' case at this time, and what would you conclude?
It's a really good question. So this is a volume of 40 essays for Cambridge University Press, and therefore it is a standard academic format. And 4,000 words is not my cup of tea either, Ian. I think what it tells you 2 things. One is Burroughs is very difficult to fit into that pigeonhole. So the format it just establishes what we already knew, which is that Burroughs is more interesting than most writers from that. What emerges from it, I think there's 2 things. One is an attempt to anchor Burroughs in the present time. In other words, this is not historical. And although my interest is largely in what happened in 1945 in Upper Manhattan, actually, what really matters is here and now. How does his work play now? What side of history does he seem to stand on? Does he offer us any, not pearls of wisdom, but, sort of words of advice for young people? How to respond? I think some of the debates have been quite interesting to observe with writers who are anxious. So, for example, one writer he had it as a footnote. He offered to cut it, and I told him to keep it, where he said, I mentioned I was writing this essay about Burroughs for this book, and they said to me, oh, Burroughs, hasn't he been cancelled yet? So I think there's an anxiety about how, in the 1950s, he was already excoriating political correctness long before it existed. And I think he did it because he felt it was better out than in. And you've written yourself brilliantly about how he relishes that which most of us would try and hide. So that side of Burroughs is difficult. There are also people who are anxious that, the alt-right have tried to claim Burroughs. It would be a tragedy if we let those bastards take him. I mean, he's our bastard. He's our monster. We need him. And we need him because he's difficult, actually, not because we can necessarily agree with him. And I mean, Kathelin said very well that he's prophetic. Some of his prophecies were not very smart. He was a hit and miss guy in that way. But so what? The scientific method is itself hit and miss. Well, I mean, you mentioned Andrew Lees's book. One of the great things about that book is he's a world famous neuroscientist who said Burroughs really helped him to live within and also escape the constraints of his discipline. Because he found Burroughs imaginative and liberating. So that's really interesting in itself. That's a kind of object lesson in what he can contribute. But I think it's difficult to synthesize Burroughs. He's just, there's so many facets. But I do think that attempt to see him from a contemporary perspective, gun control is another issue, clearly. I think this book actually ends with an essay about Burroughs as an environmentalist writer. very much on your theme, Kathelin, because I do think that his writings in the 1960s, I'm thinking of people, books like Silent Spring from 1962, the same kind of era. Yeah, he's really intuiting just how grave the situation is. This is not just abuses of nature. He can see it's the end of us.
Biosphere.
Absolutely.
The
So,
balance of the biosphere.
yeah, he was very
long term.
clear about that
Yeah.
at a time when it wasn't fashionable. And I think trying to historicize Burroughs is interesting because, just as you knew about Barn Red in a way that I didn't because I'm not American. So I think that understanding that, for example, his position on race in the 1950s actually made him quite progressive and far ahead of the pack. It's just that not many people were dealing with race, especially white people. Norman Mailer, White Negro, and Kerouac, Lilac Evening and stuff. So you put him in historical context and he's even more remarkable. But it is an attempt to kind of keep him up to date, I think, to see where he stands. And not within literary studies particularly either, because he's always going to be on a kind of odd margin of literary studies, which is fine. I mean, better on the edge than in the middle. I think, he'd rather be on the outside looking in than on the inside stuck looking out. I don't know if that's an answer to the question, but yeah.
Any other questions? This is your chance. Yeah.
Oliver.
Jim, hi.
Hi. What's always puzzled me is what on earth induced Ginsberg and Burroughs to think that Ace would actually publish Queer, because it's completely out of time in its...
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Burroughs himself said, he was told that he would go to jail if it was published. Well, it's not true, is it? Because actually there's no more sex in Queer than there is in Junkie. So that's not the sex. I think it was the humour. Junkie is a great book. I love it. But the humour is very dry. The humour in Queer, as we know, is, flamboyant in the sense of inflammatory. I'm pretty sure that's why they were worried about it. Plus, it was fragmentary, and Ace were not interested in experimental odd books. They were interested in pulp narratives. So why did Ginsberg? Oh, Ginsberg, I think, had a kind of a devotion to Burroughs, didn't he? I mean, really. But I think there was some to and fro about it. It wasn't. Ginsberg could be. Well, he put Kerouac in his place for Visions of Cody, for example, didn't he? Saying Jack is screwing around. You're not going to get published. So Ginsberg was a pragmatist in many ways. So I'm just putting two different perspectives there. On the one hand, Ginsberg was a loyalist to Burroughs. On the other hand, he was very much a pragmatist when it comes to decisions. So it could have gone either way. But they didn't try that hard to get it published, I think. And I think after a while, Burroughs probably realized this was excruciating on a personal level. But for me, it's revelatory on a political level because it shows how Burroughs was, mining his own experience in order to understand the political scene. Understanding power through his own relationship to power, which I think is just really interesting. Most writers, to me, have always seemed to be on the outside. What shall I write about today? Oh, I'll write about this. And they have great themes, but they've kind of picked the themes. The themes picked Burroughs, in case, in the way simplifying with Queer. But you're right. I mean, for me, it's always been the text that, has baffled me the most. I remember it took me a long time to realise how funny it is. And by the time I stopped laughing, I realised it's not funny at all.
Also, the only publisher they knew. So, because Ace was, of course, owned by Carl Solomon's uncle. So it was really more a question of, not is this a suitable publisher, but it's the only one that they had any contact with. And of course, it didn't work out. So, actually, since I've got this in my hand. You haven't mentioned the role of drugs in Burroughs at all, and of course the fact is that everything from the early 50s onwards was written when he was completely stoned. And are any of the essays in the book that you're putting together about that? Because it's an area that academics seem to shy away from, maybe because they've never experienced quite what Bill went through.
It's a difficult subject to write about, actually, to write well about. I used to taunt my students. I used to do a course called High Culture. Sometimes the students would say, why are we studying these writers who took drugs? And I'd say, give me a list of writers who didn't take drugs and we'll study them. That'd be a short list. I would always say to my students, okay, which words were written on which drugs? Can you point out which words were written on amphetamines or coke? So I think establishing a direct relationship is difficult. I mean, I think, you once said very well about Naked Lunch that it's hash head humour. That's pretty about as far as you can go in saying anything. I would say that the drug that we talked about briefly beforehand, yaché or ayahuasca, is much more important to Burroughs' writing, I think, than the heroin was. But again, the effects are easy to generalize about, very hard to be specific about. So I think it's difficult to write about.
Well,
it.
except that he was always stoned. I mean, let's say the last, the final trilogy, for instance, he was on methadone the entire time, on a very, very high dose as well, which made him fairly foggy most of the time. Plus, of course, he was smoking dope the whole time as well.
And drinking after
and
5:30.
Well, it depends.
Cocktails.
The older he got, the earlier that
Cocktail
got. Yeah.
I think all you're really saying is he had an incredible fucking constitution.
He certainly did.
I mean, I certainly remember when I was with him, I could not keep up with him, and I was a young, not fit, but young man.
Smoking.
I used to sneak off and throw up before we went to dinner. Yeah.
So I mean, it's a good question, but I mean, I suppose again, my attention to detail the manuscript suggests that yes, he was stoned, but that didn't stop him. There's nothing lazy about his writing. Like I say, he embraced the spontaneous sort of psychobabble. He embraced it, but the idea that he wasn't in control of his writing, I think, is a mythology that he was quite keen to promote.
He himself said that he was very sloppy, actually, many times.
I won't dispute he was sloppy. I think what I would dispute is you can tell the difference between him being sloppy and being extremely exact. And I think that's one of the things he was calling into question with cut-up methods, which problematize the relationship between chance and choice. I mean, how can you tell the difference between what's intended and what comes out? And one of the ways in which he was prophetic is quite literally, if you're cutting up words and you don't know what's going to come out of them, your own writing is taking you by surprise. So he was cultivating that. And I think that's not sloppiness, but it is not conventional understanding of controlled writing. But I think I'm sure most of us in this room have done some writing. The best lines just come into your head while you're feeding the ducks in the park or driving down the motorway. That's when you get the best ideas. Where do they come from? Or you need a good editor, yeah. But, yeah.
You talked about changing the oeuvre by attending to it. How did you decide which of three very different versions of Soft Machine to transmit and sort of alighting on version 1.5?
Yeah, I know people who love the original version of Soft Machine, which is very much a kind of long prose poem. I think you've described it well, Miles, in that way. It was an impossible task, and believe me, having spent years in the archives collecting all the material and familiarizing myself with it, I was probably in a very strange state of mind when I had that call to make. I was trying to square the circle really there, so any choices would have been difficult choices. What I've always tried to do is make my choices visible, so that other people can not just judge my work, but see what I've done. And if you would like to try doing something better, good luck to you, because it's bloody difficult. But there's also a lot of responsibility as well. I love the first version of the Soft Machine. I think it's just phenomenal, but it's also very difficult. It would be good to be reprinted on its own terms. But what I was trying to do was to actually publish the version which Burroughs, I think, achieved the best balance between versions. And that was this one from 1962 that was not published. So I was any judgments on that material was going to be difficult. It was easier with the Ticket Exploded and Nova Express. But as I say, I was just trying to make very visible what I was doing. There's no right or wrong in that respect. I just had to use my judgment. But it's a very good question, because they're all quite different texts, as you obviously know.
A question over here.
Outside of the academic world, how is Burroughs standing in popular culture today? In that, when I was a literature student in the 70s, Burroughs was very, very trendy. You carried a copy of Naked Lunch in your hand to be seen. Is he still in the generations that have gone past us, that still has that sort of iconic status? And has he managed to withstand is he still on the shelves in US libraries and high schools?
two different questions. I think to answer the first question, you need somebody under the age of 40.
I must say that last night at Reference Point, there was some amazing, performance poets and from, Black, Hispanic, French, who were in their 20s, and the audience that were very much inspired by him. So these little groups, at least, still exist, and they're very, very passionate. I would suspect that they're not the only ones in London, because he is kind of a secret, in a way. You whisper, but have you read William Burroughs? And then it changes someone's life. Great, yeah.
So I was just saying, given that control and manipulation were big themes in his work, do you think any of it reads differently in the age of social media, smartphones, and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think sort of hate speech was something that he was very good at.
But also in terms of, manipulation, controlling people's behaviour and manipulating it.
Yeah, I mean, he was interested in sort of what Vance Packard described as the hidden persuaders. This is the advertising world. So he was familiar with that. He was interested in subliminal techniques as well. And I think that because he was trying to understand things by doing them. So in many ways, he's a great practitioner of manipulation. And I think that gives you very good insights into it. Again, it's why I think he played the Ugly American so convincingly. If you want to understand the psychology, perform the role. I'm not suggesting we all go around pretending to be Elon Musk and Donald Trump, but it would give you some insights into it rather than recoiling from it and just trying to keep your distance. So I think Burroughs didn't keep a distance from himself, and those desires to manipulate I see as being really important to his understanding about power. And he was trying to manipulate people. So it helps you understand where you're coming from yourself and what desire can do to you and so on.
But I would just add briefly to that he was a great actor, and he loved to act in the group of his little friends. He'd just take on a role. And as an actor, you have to be positive towards the character that you're playing in order to fully, in order to fully portray them in all of their subtleties. If you judge, then you don't really get what's driving them. And since William was after what is really driving these people, he would go full-throatedly into these routines, into these riffs. That's my take on it. I think we have one more question. Monsieur?
He was manipulating to try to subvert hypocritical power structures. Do you think that's what he was about ultimately?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes,
Is it that obvious?
It's a very good question.
Yeah.
I mean, hypocrisy
You've
was
not mentioned any of that.
No, I know power structure, but I think power structures. I mean, one reason I love Queer is because he gives an anatomy of power based on his own personal desire for somebody who doesn't desire him. But actually, that reveals a lot of the mechanics of desire, the kind of pathology of it, to do with power. So he's well aware of that, and I think that you can learn a lot still, because the power structures are the same. Yeah, the mask may have changed or come off in some cases, but the power structures are very similar. So he's still got a lot to say on that. A good last question. So please enjoy the exhibition and check out the books. I'm sure Miles would be happy to sign a book, a biography of Burroughs, if you like. And Oliver, you have where you don't have any books here, but you have where to get them, a piece of paper or something there. Okay. But thank you very much, everybody.